Today we're focusing on reflections of police in the pandemic and the lessons for the future. This session caused me to reflect on my own police service, and whilst I witnessed many challenges and changes, none were of the scale and complexity experienced in this pandemic. So I'm thrilled that we're joined by individuals from the police service who have been at the heart of the police service response to the pandemic. Our speakers today are Chief Constable Pam Kelly from Gwent Police, from the Supers Association of England and Wales, Chief Superintendent Paul Griffis. We're also joined by Marc who's the Welsh lead for the Police Federation of England and Wales, and also fortunate to be joined by our very own Professor Colleen Rogers, who will also share his reflections with us. The event is scheduled to take just over an hour and will involve each of our speakers addressing the issue for about 10 minutes. Once all the speakers are finished, there'll be a chance for us to ask the panel questions. To enable us to run this event smoothly, please can you make sure your cameras are off and your microphones are turned to mute. If you do have any questions, please use the chat function and we'll get them to the panel at the end of the event. Okay, so our first speaker is Chief Constable Pam Kelly. Pam, thank you so much for joining us. As well as being a true friend of the University of South Wales, Pam is the Chief Constable of Gwent Police and also the National Police Chief Council lead for the Workforce Coordination Committee. Pam's passionate about serving our communities, and we are truly fortunate to have us here today, particularly because Pam was trying to take some well-earned annual leave. So Pam, over to yourself.
Thank you, Peter. It's a real privilege to spend time with you this morning, just sharing some of my reflections on this dreadful time for our communities in responding to the coronavirus crisis. So first of all, I'm just going to share with you the journey itself. I'm going to share with you some of our video footage, which I think gives you a feel for what our staff have dealt with. And then I'm going to finish in terms of some of the reflections that I have faced as a leader in policing during this time. So first of all, let's think of the background. It wasn't just a matter of dealing with the COVID crisis. Just before this, we obviously had significant flooding in Wales, and indeed, a year on, we are still facing some of those challenges for our communities. Of course, during the COVID crisis, we've had some significant protests. In Gwent Police alone over the last year, we've had about 65 protests. Some of them really important in terms of Black Lives Matters and what that means for our community voice, but also what it means for policing and making sure that equality, diversity, and of course inclusion are absolutely a part of policing. And listening is a significant part of that. And amongst all of that, needing to keep our community safe and of course, needing to keep our staff safe. So the moment that the COVID crisis hit, in all honesty, the feeling in terms of leadership in Wales, where I work really closely with the 4 Chief Constables in Wales, but also work really closely with all 43 Chief Constables across the United Kingdom. Because what is important at a time of crisis is that we work together and that we apply consistency. But I'll touch on that a little later. I immediately felt enormous public responsibility to make sure that we did everything that we could to keep communities safe. To do that, you have to act very quickly. And so just in terms of the internal structures for Gwent Police, within the first week of the pandemic, we had to make sure that our custody units had the right policies, procedures, people were equipped with the right public protection equipment and the like. We had to make sure that we had scrutiny on this so that we could keep business going as usual, but of course, make sure that we still detain those people that were committing crimes in our community. Of course, our force control room, as you understand, takes our 999 calls and of course our 101 calls needed to continue. We could not afford to fail in an emergency. So immediately I split the force control room into 3 areas to reduce the possibility of our staff being infected, but also to make sure that we could receive those calls from our community. And of course, during this time, albeit people were encouraged to stay at home, and you would think that demand for crime would reduce. And yes, indeed, crime reduced by about 13% in the first 6 months of the pandemic. Our calls for service were increasing by the day. So needing to make sure that we put processes in place to mitigate that extra demand, but to respond to those demands of communities. And of course, when we talk about responding to crisis, there is always ongoing business as usual to maintain, especially surveillance teams, our firearms response, all of those things that make sure that we still take off the street organised crime groups, and of course respond to threat and risk in our community. And of course, vulnerability, ensuring that people continue to report domestic abuse. That we responded to child protection issues and adult abuse issues was the primary focus for me during the pandemic. Victims are often isolated anyway. During a pandemic, and when we were telling people to stay at home, they were even more isolated. So lots of things to do at the very beginning. And ultimately, that real challenge from the outset to make sure that we had public PPE equipment available for our frontline staff. How can I keep community safe without first of all making sure that my staff was safe? And getting high quantities of the right quality of PPE at the initial phases of the pandemic were a real challenge for us. Of course, policing cannot do things on its own. So getting the partnership structure right from the outset was critical. So making sure that we had a strategic coordination group. And this is a group with health partners, of course, our local authority colleagues, making sure that the policing, fire, ambulance, and others were all around the table so that we acted as one public service in our response to this crisis. And that was really important. Because as many of you know, policing is not devolved to Welsh Government. And throughout this crisis, it's been really interesting, but also challenging, when of course our legislation that we must enforce in Wales has at times been very different to the legislation that was enforceable in England. Because we had to work quickly in understanding that legislation, and then making sure that our officers knew what that legislation was. And of course, that they understood their powers in order to enforce the law to keep people safe. Really difficult when, as a police service, I still report to the Home Office, but of course, work within a Welsh community, within a Welsh country with its own legislation. Challenging, but of course, as always, policing works really hard to get it right. So the College of Policing was lent on very much so at the early stages to make sure that they were interpreting legislation for English forces and Welsh forces, making sure that our staff knew what powers to use. And of course, the very sad bit about that strategic coordination group was that as a result of the death rate in Wales, we had to make sure that we had enough crematoria space, that we had enough mortuary space. All of those things that are hidden, but so important that we deal with people with dignity and respect. And of course, make sure that we do everything appropriately at point of crisis. The strategic and coordination group in my force area and across Wales was chaired by policing. And of course, warning and informing the public, making sure the public were aware of key messages, was an important part of that group to get right. One of the biggest challenges that I faced during this time was that public confidence and our communities having public confidence in policing is critical. And many of you would have heard on the news and in the way that we were chatting with communities that the 4 E's applied. You know, engaging with people, educating people, really encouraging people, and only then enforcing the law. because the legislation was changing at such pace and so frequently, communities were confused. And is it right to actually give somebody a fixed penalty notice and a fine when perhaps they didn't understand the legislation? It's a little different now. We've been living with the crisis for nearly 12 months. So educating and explaining is still important, but actually we have been moving to enforcement much quicker because our communities want to get back to normal. And policing has a role in making sure that we don't take lightly those people that are breaching the COVID restrictions. Keeping communities safe, keeping people informed, but being there to do what policing is meant to do and enforcing was also a priority for us during the crisis. Keeping business going as usual, hugely important. Police officers still attended 999 calls, antisocial behaviour, firearms incidents, a whole host of key areas of police business that we had to keep safe. So I now would like to show my first video, if I may, just around what our officers actually dealt with during the crisis. So Robin, if you could just show the first video, please, our officer attending a house party.
Hi guys, you alright?
Yeah.
Very mysteriously, we've had a call to say that there's people here who shouldn't be here and a bit of a party going on earlier on.
It's earlier on.
Yeah.
Earlier on, yeah?
Yes. Is there anyone inside that doesn't live here now?
No, not now,
Okay.
no.
Who's in there altogether?
You're gonna find me for this.
If there's no breaches, then no. If there is, then maybe.
Well, I'm not gonna pay it.
Right, okay. Why are you asking it for a fine? Surely if there's no one in there, then you wouldn't be
So
considering
if I walk in and shut my door, then you've got nothing to say about it.
I can come in.
No, you can't.
I have a power of entry under the
You got a
Coronavirus
warrant.
Act. I have a power of entry.
Have you got the warrant to come in my house?
Listen, right? Why?
No,
Listen
right.
to me.
Right. Don't, unless you got a warrant.
Get your hand off me, right? Because at the moment...
They're arresting you there now, unless you got a warrant. Oh my God! Unless you got a warrant,
Guys,
come in my house.
guys, listen. I tried to be tidy with you.
And I
What's your name?
tidy with
What's
you.
your name?
Unless you
What's
got a
your name?
warrant to come in my house.
What's your name?
I suggest.
What's your name?
You don't need my name.
Right.
She's my sister.
I'm not in dispute with that. I just don't believe that you live here because you seem like you like it.
Yeah.
That's not relevant.
It's a single parent bubble.
We're a single bubble.
Look. Excuse me. Yeah, single bubble, okay. Let me explain what that means. A person who lives on their own can be in a bubble with one. Are you going to let me speak or are you going to keep cutting in?
Yeah, enough now, Jen.
I may not find the others, but if you keep giving me that attitude, you're definitely going to have one, okay? The single bubble thing, a single parent or a single person can join the bubble with one other household.
Yeah.
There are 3 in here. So there's already a breach, isn't there?
Are you
going to listen to what I'm going to say? Look, you've breached the coronavirus regulations, okay? That is an offence at the moment. I'm going to report you for the consideration of prosecuting you for that offence. You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your offence if you do not mention now, something which will later rely on court. Anything you do say may be given. I'm reporting you both, yes.
Right.
What will happen? What will happen?
No,
is you'll have.
Thank you, Rob. We can turn the video off there,
You
Rob.
need to accept it.
Lovely, thank you. So I just wanted to share that with you for a number of reasons. The first reason is what our staff actually faced every day and continue to face it. And when you think of our staff then entering that house, putting themselves at risk, really difficult when they then have to go home to their own families. The second thing is, of course, that officer, in my view, was very professional and knew their powers and knew their legislation. So that power of entry into that home address, really critical that we made sure was right at the beginning in terms of Welsh legislation. And then, of course, as legislation was changing quite quickly during the pandemic, I needed to make sure that every single officer and member of staff knew the legislation and how to apply it on the pavement. And then thirdly, the importance of body-worn video. For me, our officers and staff put themselves in really difficult positions every single day of the week. And that body-worn footage, for me, is best evidence, but also protects our staff and allows me, when appropriate, to share what our staff are dealing with to people such as yourselves. We put that out into the press. I wanted to share with people what our staff were facing every day. I wanted our communities to see that whatever they were doing to try and protect the public, others weren't always doing the same thing. So, as a result of what our officers felt and saw and had to deal with every day, what I've made sure is that we had our own trace and contact approach within Gwent Police. But just as the NHS has a trace and contact service, I wanted my own within Gwent Police so that I could make sure that we kept people safe and that we were self-isolating when people were showing symptoms, and of course providing that link with testing centres. So that we managed our sickness rate really carefully throughout this pandemic. And I'm really pleased to say that we've kept business moving because of that. So our sickness rates have been very low. People have been self-isolating, but we invested heavily in technology 18 months ago. Every single officer and most of our staff have laptops at Gwent Police. So even when people were self-isolating, they were still working alongside their shift, working nights, working mornings, supporting the front line. Of course, because we were taking witness statements from people via technology. That investment in technology couldn't have been better. So along with South Wales Police, we invested heavily in what is called a digital services division. And that has really proved us well over this pandemic. We got to a stage where we were able to take 101 calls and people were taking them whilst they were self-isolating at their home address. So business continuity, business as usual, was maintained. But of course, when you see just that one video clip and consider that that officer might have dealt with others 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 incidents like that of an evening, and then going home to their own families, the well-being of staff has been an absolute priority for me during this pandemic. And as we look at the longer-term impact on officers and staff during this time, the well-being has actually become a priority for me within the organisation. For this year, for performance development reviews, well-being is a mandatory objective for all staff. And that is well-being looking at mental health, physical health, financial health, because we know that during this time and with the economic climate as it is, our staff, as are many in communities, like to suffer financial crisis as well. So all of this has had to be considered in terms of leadership. The one thing that is absolutely critical is that as an operational leader, I've had to work very closely with political leaders. And so that link with the My Policing Crime Commissioner, Jeff Cuthbert, has been critical. But again, when we consider consistency, we have worked very closely as 4 Chief Constables in Wales and 4 Police and Crime Commissioners in Wales. Because despite there being political differences, at this time, we've all needed to be working together to make sure that the legislation is clear and that our response is clear in terms of policing in Wales. It's never always straightforward when politics are involved, but I have to say I think we've been in a very strong position in Wales compared to forces across the bridge. But I'm sure that there will be learning on all of these issues as time unfolds. And of course, the financial element is critical as well. We all know how stretched public services are. And I know that we've already spent well over £1 million in terms of the COVID crisis alone. We have had some assistance from the Home Office to support this. But of course, it's something which is really difficult for us when we're trying to build organisations for the future, but money that was not planned to be spent is being spent in time of crisis. And what is important as well, that whilst we have one future on the here and now, what does the actual future look like in terms of crime? So already I'm anticipating, as lockdown eases, as we're able to be out and about in communities more, I have absolutely no doubt that there will be antisocial behaviour issues, crime trends. People will be out in pubs and clubs, and that often means that there's violence and assaults combined with alcohol. So we are expecting, as the pressure valve it actually eases for people, that will have an impact on our policing and our demand for service. So really complicated for us in terms of our financial planning for the future, because how can we plan for the unknown? And of course, there might be another crisis around the corner. I'm just going to show another video, and then I'm just going to finish on some personal reflections and on some learning the lessons that I think are really important during this time. And that's why I'm really keen to share this with university students who, of course, will be a part of policing in the future. But I'd like to share with you one other video, if I may. Okay, Robin?
He's been a police officer for 28 years, but what Steve Thorpe faced dealing with a group out during lockdown left him shocked, worried for his health and the risk to his family.
One of them's come over to the side of our vehicle, pulled down his scarf and coughed in the window, very much at me, and then said, "I've got COVID," and off he went. When then somebody weaponises that and directly or targets you directly, it's horrific.
This type of attack, the weaponising of COVID, has been growing during the pandemic as officers try to enforce lockdown rules. A new report found almost a third of officers faced people using COVID as a weapon, threatening to breathe or cough on them. Nearly a quarter say people deliberately coughed or breathed on them, and 1 in 4 officers believe they have contracted the virus.
Okay, thank you, Robin. So when you actually listen to Steve, and Steve is one of our Federation leads in Gwent Police, and I think articulated very well the impact on staff at this time. And we've recently done a piece of work at Gwent Police on behalf of our partners in the Joint Emergency Services Group. So this is emergency workers, firefighters, the ambulance service, ourselves. And what we've found is that in the last 20 months, there have been over 4,000 assaults on emergency workers, not just police, emergency workers, health workers, ambulance staff, fire service and police. And for policing, that has been 1 in 3, including British Transport Police, 1 in 3 of our officers have been assaulted. Now, many might say that might just be a push or a shove, or somebody might have spat at them. There is nothing more vulgar at any time for officers to be spat at. But during this time, we have seen that people have been weaponizing COVID and spitting at. And it's, we are pushing, so over 50% of the 4,000 assaults have resulted in people being charged with assaults against emergency workers. But we are taking a no tolerance stance on this. And I suppose this leads me on to something that I feel really passionate about at this moment in time that needs to be put right. And as a leader in policing, and Peter Vaughan, I know, would agree with me on this, sometimes you have to be very vocal. You have to say what's right, and you have to make sure that you speak on behalf of your staff and support your staff. And one of the things that really pains me at the moment is that I totally understand the need for, of course, vulnerable people to be vaccinated. But as you've seen from the 2 videos that I've shown you today, our police officers are on the front line, often working in an uncontrolled environment where PPE, masks and hand sanitizer are not available. And yet they go into those houses without a vaccination. They knock on people's doors who are supposed to be self-isolating to check that they are self-isolating, and yet are not vaccinated themselves. And so myself and the Police and Crime Commissioners have been working really hard with Welsh Government and the UK Government, and in fairness, very, very closely with our Federation and Supers Association colleagues to be the voice of the service in wanting to protect staff. And so these are the reflections that we all have to make at time of crisis. What is the impact on our community? What is the impact on public service? What is the impact on our staff? And of course, what is the impact as us as individuals as we take on some of that responsibility? It's been a really tough year in policing, but I can say I have never been so privileged to lead such a fantastic organisation, and I have never been so privileged to be a part of policing. And I hope those reflections have helped you today and that I haven't gone on too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Not at all. Absolutely fantastic to hear those reflections on the issues that you presented. You graphically described both verbally and with the video. So thanks for that. If we now move on to Pam will be back later for questions. And I would say if you've got any questions to ask, please start populating the chat room so that we can get onto those at the end of after the last speaker. Our next speaker is Marc Bleasdale. Marc joined Dyfed-Powys Police many years ago, following him gaining a law degree in the University of Birmingham. Marc is the Welsh lead for the Police Federation of Wales and England, and we are very fortunate today to have Marc with us to listen to his reflections on the pandemic. So Marc, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm just hoping my screen sharing skills, which I've only learned this morning, are beginning to work. So has that come through as a PowerPoint, reflections on policing?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction, Peter, and just a quick sort of summary of what I do within the Police Federation. This is a role that's only existed for 2 years. And that the purpose of it was that the Federation identified that there was a gap in information that was being fed into Welsh Government, policymakers, as well as to the Chief Constables and the Police and Crime Commissioners, and that there was seen as being a difference in Wales, and that was because of the status of the Welsh Government and its ability to make its own legislation. That even though policing's not devolved to Wales, they can still legislate on matters that affect policing, and that's certainly something that the last year has brought to the fore. So, which is why I've sort of, I've said that we are the Police Federation of England and Wales. That's the official title, but actually my role just tries to concentrate on what's going on in Wales, and at times can be very frustrating because from a Westminster point of view, and then also from the national organisation, that's the Chiefs Councils, as well as the National Police Federation, there's a learning process about how the Federation, how Wales is a different structure, and that affects policing, and it also affects the public. So, on my reflections on the last year, I'm going to start us off with this was an internal email sent out within the Police Federation as an all-user email. It came from Simon Kempton, who is our national operations lead. So he was involved in, and still is, our representative on the Operation Tala Gold meetings. So those are, for those that don't know, the national structure of meetings. Operation Tala Gold is the main police operational meeting where they discuss issues across the country. Anyway, this is what Simon sent out to us: is that the Welsh Government has not adopted the same approach as Westminster in enacting emergency legislation. This is on the 18th of February, remember. Giving police powers in relation to the outbreak. This is of some concern. And he went on to say, as it stands, our colleagues in Wales would not be able to fall back on legislation where the circumstances were such that it would be helpful or necessary. Now, so that is the 18th of February. That was 369 days ago. In the meantime, my understanding is, and obviously there's been some changes to legislation guidance in the last week or so, but at the last count, the Welsh Government had legislated on the coronavirus pandemic on 80 occasions. That was roughly 40 occasions to bring in new legislation and then 40 pieces to overturn previous bits of legislation or to clarify it. So so that's what we've had in the last year. So going back to this 369 days ago, that information that came out internally within the Police Federation was that we were aware, and my background as an operational police officer I spent 3 years working in Pembrokeshire as a division of Dyfed-Powys Police, which has an unusually high number of coma sites. So as a county, that is not only police officer, the police, but also the other emergency service and the local authority. They're well versed at dealing with and preparing for emergency situations. Vast majority of that is in relation to the petrochemical industry. But my recollection of that, and still, I'm pretty sure it's still the case, still the number one risk that faced the UK or faced Pembrokeshire was pandemic flu. And that is something that we exercised. And I remember exercising this at the SARS outbreak. And I think the learning from this, though, is that still that exercising, and as I understood, the exercising that went on in February last year, still was dealing with the things that the Chief Constable touched upon at the outset, is what do we expect to have to deal with? I expect, as a health pandemic, we're the police, we're probably not going to have a lot of involvement in this, other than probably having to deal with a lot of deaths because we act on behalf of the coroner. So that effectively was the sort of the level of preparation. From our point of view, within the Police Federation, we were just looking at how are the people that we represent in Wales, the 7,100 or so police officers, are they going to have adequate protection in terms of PPE, so that when they're dealing with situations of the virus, we will be adequately equipped. You've got to remember, still at this time, the only police powers were in relation to enforcing some health provisions. So they were only really to effectively to direct people to go for COVID testing, or and possibly to exercise that by way of force. They weren't powers of entry granted at the time, and there certainly weren't any powers around fining people or fixed penalties. So, as I mentioned there, the police powers in relation to healthcare settings, not really an issue. And that going back to my initial, the second slide that was highlighted within the Police Federation, you've got to remember in this context, we're now 1 year later. That time, 369 days ago, the Welsh Government didn't think there was a policing issue in relation to this because they chose not to legislate. That legislation to give police officers power, those initial powers, actually had to be granted through Westminster. So we're still a year away from this at the moment. From the Police Federation point of view, what were our business continuity plans? And the reality is we're representing those 7,000 officers that occasionally fall ill or need representing in the workplace. We didn't have any business continuity plans to actually deal with this. We were just about getting our head around working with teams for remote working. The pandemic has actually changed the way we do business. I think internally it has given us the opportunity to communicate in a very different way. And I can only refer back to even our own branch from representing officers. The way we would communicate with the rest of the elected officials, we'd send some emails out, or we would wait for a statutory meeting. Police Federation is an organisation that's 101 years old. And at the time, really, the operating businesses were still 101 years old as well, in that everything was run by committee. Teams and technology has allowed for fast time decision-making, sharing of information that never really took place before. And just an example, in my old branch, the chair and the secretary, to be fair to them, very quickly set up a process where all of the elected reps were able to dial in to meetings, whereas drawing people down from Welshpool to a meeting was something that only happened every quarter. Now we were able to actually gather the information that what was actually going on, which I think probably hasn't been recognised within the police service. That actually provided a lot of reassurance to members, to saying that the local chairs and secretaries were going to local silver and gold meetings and being able to report back quickly to the elected reps. This is what's going to happen, providing that reassurance amongst the or in the workplace. Other things that we were expecting to happen, officers were worried about potential public order, extinction rebellion protests were expected, and in effect they did happen, but on a much lower scale than they probably would have taken place without the pandemic. And also we were expecting there to be a lot of hate crime towards the Chinese community, and there were at those initial stages, but I think in effect that tapered off. Okay, staff association issues. So again, as I said, we're representing 7,000 officers in Wales. Some of those officers do have health conditions. Some of them obviously were pregnant. And how did that work around their self-isolating and their work status? And to be fair, in general, the leadership of the four forces were quickly engaged with this to make sure that those people were able to work from home, and there was you could see there was going to be a wider need for other people to work from home. And as the Chief Constable mentioned, a wider dissemination of technology to individuals has allowed people to perform a policing role from their own house, which again, pre-pandemic, I don't think probably wouldn't have been palatable to a lot of senior police leaders, because there's an expectation that everybody comes to the police station, we work as a team from there, and we send everybody out, rather than people staying and actually being able to perform a very useful policing function. You know, I don't think anybody would have predicted a year ago that a police officer or a member of police staff could answer a 101 call, which is effectively a sub-emergency call for a member of the public from their laptop at a station, you know, which is not in a police station. Right, here comes that. So we're now still pre-pandemic. 1 week later, so it's still 3 weeks before the lockdown. At that stage, there were 13 cases in the UK, and PPE began to become an issue nationally, because the stocks of PPE that were going to be available for police officers wasn't as expected. So that became a rolling issue around what should officers do to protect themselves. So there were some in the almost really we were talking through scenarios, and some were saying, well, you know, we're not being equipped with any visors, we're not being equipped with aprons. Most officers at that stage had been equipped with a face mask of some sort, but that again wasn't really that for some officers that wasn't really sufficient. So the Police Federation had a role in explaining to people, we will get some official PPE guidance from Public Health England and from the NHS Wales that will actually say, for working in that environment, that is what you need, because the expectation of what PPE required far outweighed what was realistically required to protect yourself from the pandemic. So initial impact for us within the Police Federation, and also to try and explain our linkages into the Police Liaison Unit. For those of you that are not aware, the Chief Constables and the PCCs pay for a small unit of police officers and police staff that's embedded in the Welsh Government. That is a unique arrangement in the United Kingdom. There's not one in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and within England and Westminster, it's just a completely different beast. So we were fortunate enough in those early stages where there was the frustrations around communication to be linked in with that unit to actually be able to give feedback on what members of the police service or members of the Police Federation were feeling, and what they felt as though the challenges that were to come along. And also that first few weeks of the lockdown, as the Chief Constable referred to, there was a significant reduction in demand for police officers, and as I've mentioned earlier as well, we became more agile in the way we had to work, which meant that we were more flexible about where people had to work from. And the interesting thing about home working is it's something that, as a tactic for us representing individuals who had health concerns pre-pandemic, where there was quite often a little bit of a battle with middle management within organisations to say, could this people who had been off ill, could they come back and actually work from home for a while they embedded themselves back into the workplace? And quite often there was a resistance to that. more modern thinking managers were quite comfortable with it because they saw that as a way of getting work out of people and actually getting them to contribute to the overall policing effort. So again, this is another pandemic positive for serving police officers because it gives demonstrates the opportunity to be able to do a policing role. Obviously, they can't go out and do those things that the Chief Constable shown on those videos, but they can actually contribute to the policing effort. So the main theme of what I want to talk about from now on is, I suppose, is an observed frustration from police officers who are having to deliver legislation around where the messaging may have been difficult, and also you've got the divergence in legislation. So an example of this was back on the 1st of May. At that stage, England had guidance that members of the public should socially distance from each other, and that was 2 meters. When Wales first enacted its legislation, they made that was in a regulation. That was the law. Now, the reality was that the directive that came from the Chief Constables, we were in a phase there of the 4 E's principles, which was actually trying to engage with members of the public, explain what the purpose of the legislation was, and that worked in most cases. But that was just reflecting on it. That was the first sign that we were going to have some significant challenges in explaining to some members of the public that actually the law is different in England and Wales. So as I mentioned there earlier, I think, and it's only through some of the research that we've had our political advisor to do on our behalf, is that there've been approximately, and this information is probably about 3 weeks old, so the numbers are higher already, is that in England, there have been 60 pieces of legislation in relation to policing powers in relation to COVID, whereas in Wales we've had 80. Now, that may not sound particularly different, and the legislation may not sound particularly different, but the reality is that we work on borders, and we also work with a very transient population through the UK. So people coming from England into Wales and not understanding that the regulations were different. This got particularly highlighted in the just towards the end of the summer, when and the Chief Constable touched upon it, is when does politics start to impact on policing? And the reality is it does impact on us quite regularly, but this was a significant one. So this is the week where eventually by 6 o'clock on a Friday night, it was unlawful to travel from a COVID level 3 area, or sorry, level 2 or level 3 area in England and travel into Wales. Now, through this dialogue that I mentioned that we had with the police liaison unit, we're aware of this about a week beforehand, and also that dialogue became very public because the First Minister was asking the Prime Minister to legislate on that, because within England people could still travel around. You know, they were limited around. There were some limitations around which tier they were in at the time. Now, that negotiation or persuasion, however you want to phrase it, was unsuccessful, and there became effectively a standoff. Which by the Wednesday, the public announcement was that we're going to legislate on it. So in reality, then the media interest in this, there became a thirst for it, and I found myself doing media interviews at a level that I'd never done before, and probably never expected again at the pandemic, with Sky News, News 24, Radio 5 Live, all asking that same question. And the Police Federation of England and Wales' position was that this legislation is unenforceable. Strictly, that probably wasn't correct, because you've still got to enforce the legislation, but the practicalities of police officers having to deal with these situations we could see as being very frustrating. If I take you back to the role of the police liaison unit, the police liaison unit for Wales, for guidance for police officers as they literally walk out through the door of a police station and have to go and deal with the situation, was coming from the College of Policing. Now, so the practicalities were Welsh Government would make some regulation changes. Paul Morris from Police Liaison Unit would forward that off to the College of Policing, and they would produce some guidance which would come back and be available for police officers. Some forces were trying to be on the front foot and provide some local guidance on that. But this week I think was particularly significant, and it is a learning lesson for the future, because it got to 11 o'clock on the Friday morning and there was still no legislation. So there were police officers coming into work that night, and the legislation did get enacted. But if I talk about having to provide the guidance as to when you're going to deal with this legislation, that just wasn't there. And at 6 o'clock that night, that legislation came into place, which again is particularly frustrating, worrying for individual police officers, because they don't really want to be seen to be enforcing law that they know is later going to get challenged. So, I think that's from a legislation point of view, that is just not practical. It isn't something that we'd ever exercised for or practiced for, because as police officers, as I mentioned before, we're used to exercising and dealing with in training scenarios. And of course, the culture within the police service normally is legislation probably takes, from the time you first hear about it to it actually taking place or being enacted, and the power existing for police officers quite often takes more than a year. And this time we were getting it, this was happening within hours, and then officers were being expected to deal with and enact that legislation. And of course, we go back to the working environment of a Fed rep, and I was speaking to Peter earlier on that he was aware of one of his members of staff spent his summer working on an ironing board, while I was doing interviews for Sky News, News 24. That's the working environment that we've got now, and that's also the working environment that probably a lot of police officers are working from, who are working from home. So a longer term thing for police officers or the police services, if we can have a lot more people working from home or working in an agile way, how do we actually make sure that is a good, quiet working environment? Right. I am beginning to wrap up now. So this is again a frustration when I was dealing with a lot of media inquiries. They'd be very similar. I'd be sitting in front of this laptop and someone would say, well, the rules say this, that and the other. The reality is the rules are a nonsense, or they're a legal nonsense. And the only rule that I am aware that was ever publicly talked about was Mr. Drakeford's rule of thumb, which again is of no legal standing whatsoever. The government was issuing guidance and issuing law, or in the form of regulations. The guidance really sitting in a document, and then there'll be frequently asked questions published on the website. But this is just an example of it, which funny enough, again, I know is already out of date, because this is a paper that our political advisor prepared for our Welsh Affairs subcommittee. So the guidance in relation to travel and exercise, what it says is travel is limited to essential travel only. And then when it comes down to exercise, it says you can leave your home as often as you like for exercise, as long as you do so with one other person. It should be undertaken locally, and in general, this must not involve people driving to a location away from their home. This is the bit that's changed last week. And no journeys of any significant distance should be taken, for example, to exercise in the countryside or beauty spots, etc., etc. And the police can fine people who travel beyond their local area to beauty spots. If you look at the regulations say exercise must start and finish at the home of where the person is living. That's not a very tight definition, in my opinion, as a police officer. There's no mention of driving to or from any area, although the most recent guidance now actually says you can drive within your area, and it's intended for people with disabilities. And you've got locally is not defined within the legislation. Neither is general, neither is significant distance, and neither is countryside or beauty spot. It states that the company in the accompanying F of frequently asked questions is this is the law and not the guidance. So that's in relation to the regulation we've got. So is this really the case? Because this is the scenario really, and that's a notional scenario. I live in Llandilo. Can I travel down the M4, drive down to a village called Llantryd Major, walk on the coast path, go to Aberthaw Power Station, because I find that industrial architecture beautiful? I think I'm acting within the regulations there, but I'm not acting within the guidance, and there are no rules in relation to that. And of course, and a practical example that I'm aware of is that just within the Dyfed-Powys area, you've got an area of the beacons. A call comes in that there are some members of the public up on the beacons. They're headed there by the control room inspector says, I think they're breaching the legislation. Those members of the public got tickets because they were not socially distancing, essentially. But actually, when the officers went back to the station and they looked at it themselves, these are frontline officers. Half of the room, as I'm told, half of the room thought that legislation, that's not within the legislation, and half thought that was the same. No, I don't think that's an acceptable position for frontline police officers to be in. So again, just some of the challenges. Next 6 months from the learning of this, we're still internally, police officers, we're going to have to deal with officers and staff that need to shield and be away. Long COVID, is that actually, from an equality legislation point of view, is that going to be regarded as a permanent disability? That will affect equality legislation in relation to police officers and what they are deployed to. And if the health service is experiencing PTSD, I would imagine there will be some police officers, those that have worked on COVID teams, they've probably been dealing with numerous sudden deaths, that may affect some of them. Service provision, Chief Constable touched upon it as well. Economic downturn, that generally results in acquisitive crime. Activism and protest, as soon as the restrictions allow more of that will be an increased policing demand. And then finally, I think what we haven't had in relation to Welsh legislation so far is nobody's ever actually challenged that through the challengeable methods through High Court, etc. High Court, Supreme Court as it now is. So I think at some stage, depending on how that legislation is framed, there are the potential for those sort of legal challenges. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Marc, thank you so much. Clearly articulating there the confusing piece that is being a police officer in Wales, sometimes compared to your colleagues in England, and I'm sure we'll come back to that later with the questions and answer session we've got. Next up is Colleen Rogers. Professor Colin Rogers is the Professor of Policing and Security here at the University of South Wales. And prior to that, he was a police officer with South Wales Police. He's fairly recently returned to us from Charles Sturt University in New South Wales, where he was helping the New South Wales Police and their education programme for police officers. Colin is a voracious publisher of books, academic and practical papers. And Colin, it's great to have you involved in this session this morning or this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. I think Lisa will probably change my my screen to introduce my slides. I hope, Lisa.
It's coming now, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anyway, the fascinating presentation so far, and I'm hoping that my presentation will complement and explore some of the issues that have been raised by my colleagues this morning. And the title of my presentation might be a little bit confusing when it says Home Rule for Policing ? And my presentation is about reflecting on the future of administration work for police after the pandemic. And the reasons for the title, I think, will become clearer as my presentation progresses. So, thank you. Could you put the next slide, please? Thank you very much. As we have seen, and rightly so, much focus so far has been upon the effects of the pandemic upon frontline policing. And that is very reasonable because the issues such as legitimacy, enforcement, and safety and well-being are of course prevalent. they should be for police staff. Police officers are at risk of infection, and they deal with COVID rule breaches, as we've seen in the first presentation. And they also have to deal with increasing calls for mental health issues and so on. So they are at risk themselves, and we should, of course, consider this. But the focus of this presentation is slightly different, and hopefully will start or contribute to an ongoing narrative about the future of policing and police working. But this focus is about how the impact COVID-19 pandemic could have on the future of police administration in England and Wales. And by police administration, I mean the support staff function that supports police officers to do their jobs. So, interestingly as well, support staff, the admin staff in the police organisation, rarely researched or even considered in police research by academics and others. I wonder if I got the next slide, please. So, the obvious example of change, I think, in administration that I would like to draw upon today is that of working from home. Sometimes this is called by different names. Predominantly, I hear lately the term agile working, and this has been touched upon again by some of the previous presentations. Now, what I mean by the working from home is the removal of staff from the offices at central police locations to carry out their work in a domestic location, so it's a geographic location involved. And in January 2021, 43% of working adults overall in this country reported that they are working from home, and that approach was considered to be the norm for their business. So we've seen quite a big change from 2014, when the UK figure was just under 14%. And previous to that, in 1998, that figure was 11%. So we have quite a real increase in the number of people who worked at home because of the coronavirus in the last 12 months. I seem to have lost my slides. Lisa, there we go. So this is not, however, a new approach to work. So while some forces have engaged in this practice in the past, it does appear that this is an area that has been normally reserved for senior administration or for police posts, which are in senior position, and not a general practice. And this, unfortunately, is despite the Employment Rights Act of 1996, which gave the right to request flexible and home working for all employees. We've gone back. We seem to be having some kind of technical problem. Anyway, moving on. Using the concept of working from home as an example of COVID-enforced administration changes, we can open up this discourse around the possible implications for the future of police administration and organisation following the pandemic. For me, there are three main areas where the change needs to be considered, and I've listed them below. However, it is important to acknowledge that whilst I discuss three of them separately, these entities overlap and interact and so on. But these concerns that I'm going to talk about briefly in the next few minutes are indicative of the type of issues that police leaders and managers may have to face within a new type of workforce. So, change the next slide, please, to technology considerations. So, there are some issues, I think, that leaders and managers in the future need to be cognizant of for workers and the organisation as a whole. So the first one is the updating of technology to ensure that remote workers are able to function. So what we found, I think, in the last 12 months is that older technologies have been found out. So, for example, technologies that were prevalent before COVID, such as Skype, may not be as reliable as they should be. And the pandemic, I think, has clearly highlighted the fact that remote working can be achieved via such technology as Zoom and Microsoft Teams. Now, on top of that, there will be a need to consider the increase in the purchase of laptops, tablets, etc. And there are financial implications that police leaders, police managers need to factor into future budgetary considerations. And this, in time of austerity, and we're still going through austerity, and there will be presumably an economic downturn after the COVID-19 pandemic has eased, will be another major challenge for police leaders. If we expect our workforce to be working from home using up-to-date technology, then we need to make sure, the police will need to make sure that IT training will be enhanced to enable remote workers to function effectively at home. And that includes such things as protocols around online behaviours. To support this, of course, the organisation would have to enhance the IT support function. So that 9 till 5 working for support needs, it needs to reflect remote workers who work outside normal 9 to 5 hours. So there will be a need, I think, to look at the way the organisation will support its remote and agile workers. Also linked, I think, to the technology considerations is the idea of security and confidentiality of information, and that will remain a major concern, and that lies in the area of software and how we can ensure that people who work at home or work on sensitive databases and so on can be sure that their computers and laptops and so on are not subject to attacks and the leaking of information. Next slide, please. The second area I just want to briefly touch upon is that of organisational business, and we've heard today that it was a big drive for the police was to make sure that it was business as usual, and rightly so, to try and keep going. And we heard actually about the partnership work, and it was really interesting to hear the Chief talk about the strategic group that was put in place. But in the future, we're going to need, I think, to have a very close liaison with police partnerships to ensure that there's a compatibility with agencies as well as with other forces, and particularly in this area of technology. So we know that police work with many partners to conduct their business, but we also know that historically, traditionally, there has been problems with the exchange of information for many reasons, such as different confidentiality agreements and so on. And again, this brings me nicely on to the organizational business aspect of sort of the surrounding confidentiality and security when police will work with other agencies in terms of their organizational business. There will be a need, I think, to consider the police estate. That is the number of offices and buildings. Do the police require the number of buildings they currently use? And on top of that, there's the idea of different kinds of space might be required for non-virtual meetings, work that involves a social aspect. And we do like to meet around the coffee machine or the water bottle and chat about what was on television last night and so on. So there's more involving work than just being paid to do a job. And so there has to be some kind of acknowledgement that remote workers may need to come in occasionally, even if it's just for a social aspect in terms of meeting and so on. But that means a rejigging, perhaps, of the police estate, the police office idea. If the police then should revisit the police estate and decide to reduce the number of offices, reduce the number of geographic space for that they need to have, and ultimately sell some of these buildings off, then there would need to be some kind of consideration, perhaps, that this kind of money could be reinvested into support for home workers. Another major aspect, I think, is that the organisation itself needs to move to a more objective, focused approach to work for home workers to achieve. And I'll touch more upon that in the next section I talk about. But the next part I'd like to just raise is really important, and I'm sure that most switched-on police organisations are aware of this anyway. But there needs to be a more in-depth understanding of the well-being and mental health issues that go along with home workers, and there needs to be great support for them. So this will also have an impact on the welfare and well-being support for staff, and the organisational structure will have to include an enhanced welfare department to cater for this kind of support for its workers. Can I move on to the next slide, please, which is that of organisational culture, and this probably is a real tough area, I think, for the police to consider for the future. What do I mean by the organisational culture? Well, simply I could say that it's the glue that holds the organisation together. That's a terminology that's been used before. Sometimes we can sum it up by saying it's the way we do things around here. That is, that's the way the policy is interpreted, and the norms and the rules that we operate by. And I think that this is the future will have a major challenge for the organisational culture. Police administration tends to reflect the hierarchical structures in the police itself, and there are reasons why the hierarchy is there, of course, and there are good reasons. Self-contained offices, which are clearly organisationally delineated, closely supervised, with rigid working practices, which I think will need to be changed for the future. This, of course, is reflected in many organisations. They have this kind of rigid structure, but of course it does seem to be prevalent in policing and reflects the rank structure and the organisation of policing. So many supervisors and managers and staff will need to work closer together in remote working in terms of agreeing objectives and timescales. And supervisors will need to have a different kind of mindset, I think, to what we have traditionally, historically seen in terms of policing administrative staff. Also, there may be a need, or will be a need, to see the removal of something called presenteeism. That is the idea that one has to be in work all the time, regardless of the reasons why you should be absent. Presenteeism is the opposite to absenteeism. So the focus of home working, the focus of supervising home workers is on the production of agreed outputs, the quality of work, not necessarily being sat in front of a computer screen from 9 till 5. So there will be a need, I think, for increased trust in workers. I think the supervision must be moved more to objective working and not by attendance, and understanding the whole concept of this idea of flexible approach to working. Sometimes this has been referred to in the past as empowerment, but it is basically about trusting your staff to work within agreed parameters and providing the correct support for them to enable them to do that. And that, I think, is something that is quite, might be quite difficult for the organisational culture to accept. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So briefly, it is a brief presentation on some of the thoughts and reflections on this kind of police work. So I wanted to introduce this discussion surrounding the future, just one aspect of police work following the pandemic, and it was that of the administration function. Now, I understand that clearly there are many police functions that cannot be carried out by staff working at home, and that is, of course, a given. But the current situation has opened up an opportunity for the police organisation to reflect upon the important role of its administration functions and workforce. There are, of course, problems associated with the kinds of changes that I've been talking about and those that needs to be introduced once the pandemic is over. And these are, of course, challenges for leaders. But I think if we reflect upon the lessons learned and the potential future and consideration of these problems, this will mean a smoother transition to a different approach to police administration function in the future. And I think I'll leave it at that at the moment. We really need to reflect upon what the police organisation in terms of the administration functions has learnt over the last 12 months, take those lessons forward, produce a more effective and efficient administrative support function for policing in the future. Thank you very much.
Colin, thanks so much for that. Some great themes and yeah, some overlapping themes there as well. And I hope everybody's able to stay with us. I know we may have gone on a little bit longer than we originally anticipated, but I think the quality of the inputs is such. I think it's been great that we get to hear them. And speaking of quality inputs, we've got a great friend of the university now, Paul Griffis, who's going to speak to us about his experience. Paul, as well as being a good friend, is also the president of the Superintendents Association for England and Wales, and prior to that, or probably still is, a Gwent police officer. So, Paul, thanks so much for joining with us, and over to you for your reflections.
No problem at all, and I'll try and keep this fairly focused because I am conscious of time. And I've tried not to duplicate what other speakers have said, but I just want to go back to March 2020 and that first announcement, and just 20 minutes before that, someone very senior in the powers unit in the Home Office rang me to say, do us a favour, can you just watch the Prime Minister's announcement and then ring me back? So, you know, we, as we all did, most of the country watched that first announcement of the lockdown on the 23rd of March. And I rang the Home Office official back and he said quite literally, we haven't drafted the legislation. We've got about 36 hours to do so. Could you give me your early reflections from a policing perspective? And we worked through the night to make sure that actually we were airing some of the views over where this could take us. Like most of society, we were also in shock as to what we were facing. And we worked the following evening, and you know, and everybody was trying to interpret the rules, the regulations, the health advice, etc. And really tricky times. And who would have thought at that time, then when we knew that it was a health and economic emergency, we'd end up in a situation with 121,000 deaths. Something that was quite unimaginable over a year ago. And it's touched us as a police family as well. 25 police officers and staff have been taken by the disease. And we've also experienced those challenges like the rest of society in terms of being the infection rates and contracting the disease. So early on, the absence rate across the whole service rose to about 17.5%, and 20% is where it really starts getting concerning. And then it dropped, like, you know, we saw, didn't we, during the summer months, down to about 4 to 5%, which was pretty normal. Not perfect, but pretty normal. And then obviously we've seen on this next wave, it rising to about 9%, and now it's just starting to drop off. So there is some follow through in terms of what goes on in policing is what we see in society. And as we've alluded to earlier on, 999 calls, 101 calls were down during those lockdown periods, but actually the online work really rose, as you would expect with the change in technology. You know, and crime and incidents were down, arrests and custody were down. But the reality was we were genuinely concerned about vulnerability issues out there and fraud issues that were impacting on the public, and trying to do our very best. Now Marc's alluded to some of the powers that we had, and in one sense, this whole idea of national powers hit that border issue, didn't it? England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, the four nations. And living at a location which is where I was trying to interpret the English law, trying to interpret the Welsh law, having a son that lives in Wales and works in England. It was tricky times, and I think, you know, we had to be really cognizant of what the public were going through in terms of, as they were transitioning and travelling through different locations, actually what that impact could be. Our approach, the 4 E's that were alluded to earlier on, seemed to work. It was a bit clunky for the first 2 weeks. All forces were going off in different directions of interpretation, and actually it took a little bit of time for us to get a little bit of cohesion across nationally. And that sort of work and effort that was going in the background. We talked about PPE for officers and protecting them. The reality, what was going on in the background is, for 1 week, we had 4 versions of the same guidance on PPE. You know, and that was the challenges for the police service. It was about communication and clarity of thought that was really important. And yes, we fought our battles around testing. And yes, we are still fighting battles around vaccines. And, you know, as a Supers Association, we fully recognise the importance of those who are most vulnerable and where the mortality rates are, getting the first exposure to the vaccine. But there is a good business case for frontline emergency services and key workers to be on the next tranche of vaccinations because of the way they interact with the public. And that's not me doing it on behalf of my members, because actually our members work in a pretty much a controlled environment, but that's around frontline officers and staff who are out there in and out of houses all the time. And then there was well-being issues that were starting to percolate through, and the whole environment that we were working in was not just a cause of risk around health with the way that COVID was getting weaponized, but also the drain for some officers who were 8 to 10 hours in front of a screen. And I know that many of us on this call would have experienced that type of environment. What you wouldn't see in the background nationally was the immense work that went on conditions of service. So quite literally, on call, rest days in lieu, annual leave, the liability for officers, and sadly death on duty. There's a lot of work that goes on in the background to make sure that the conditions of service are right, so that everybody is in the best place possible to deal with this national emergency. But conscious of time, I am going to just actually focus my reflections on 4 R's. The role of policing, the relationships, the resilience, and the recovery. And I'd just like us to reflect on the role of policing. For the last 10 years, in my opinion, we've moved very much from the public space into the private space. You know, where technology has taken us, where vulnerability crimes have taken us, it's very much into people's homes or online, and that's become a greater part of our work. But what this did was almost change that in one sense on its head. And really, policing the public space became very, very important in terms of our role in preventing the transmission of the disease. So while that was going on, actually the online and the vulnerability was still a focus for concern. And actually what was happening with policing was changing in a paradigm place in terms of the way it was interacting with the public. And that caused at times some fragmentation of society. It caused a bit of a test on legitimacy. And let's try and be fair to police officers. They were learning the rules at the same rate and time that the public were learning them as well. And there was times when public announcements were going on politically, where quite literally people were trying to interpret them immediately, actually sometimes even before legislation was enacted. And I've worked with legislation where it can take 12 to 18 months to bring legislation in. And we were talking about 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, an incredible pace. And I think it just started to impact on the role of policing. And I think we steered a very steady ship over the last 12 months in recognising this was a health and economic emergency and trying to steer policing in the best way possible. Let's cover the second R, which is relationships. Never before has it been so important to have a really strong relationship with our other public service agencies and civil society. And I think what it's drawn out for me is not only the areas that we try to maximise that benefit, such as vulnerability, the civil contingency work that Pam covered off in terms of, you know, sadly, the rise of deaths and the control of the health environment. But I think what this may test out in the longer term is what I would call coterminosity, you know, and that geographical bound that the public services work to, because it's not a neat fit across the country. It is a patchwork setup, and actually the more coterminosity, in my view, the better it would be in terms of joint agency working. And then let me talk about the third R, which is resilience. I think we've underestimated the impact on policing and public services. I'm very fortunate that I get to speak to the Home Secretary probably roughly every 8 weeks because of my role. And I have raised the fact that we are starting to see an impact and feedback around individual and what I would describe as organisational fatigue and well-being. And I think we're starting to see this in the health service and other public services as well as policing. This has gone on for a long time. We are very, very good at dealing with major incidents and turning chaos into normality. But we have not experienced, almost since the war, something that has gone on at this gravity and this amount of time. Whenever you mention culture in policing, there is sometimes inevitably a negative connotation. But the reality is there is the positive culture, the can-do culture, that ability to turn out the extra effort to deal with this national emergency. It's quite incredible what the police service as a whole has done during this time of crisis. But it's never gone on for this long, never at this scale, and never with this sort of impact. So we've got to be really careful about what is the knock-on effect. And what is not seen by many is many of the events that were due to take place last year have been deferred to this year. And now they're getting pushed further back down the year. And on top of that, we've got some really big events coming up with the G7 down in Cornwall and the COP26 in Glasgow, where mutual aid will call upon policing to do that extra bit again on top of what could have been 18 months of extra bits. These are officers that have not really maximised their leave, their rest days, and they've not truly had recuperation and rehabilitation that they probably need and deserve. So it's something that as leaders we need to be really, really aware of. And then finally, can I just talk about recovery? And there's lots of things here. And Colin covered a little bit of this off, is we have had a technological paradigm shift in policing for the positive. It has forced people to carry business as usual, but do it remotely. And there's pros and cons. The advantages are terms of time saving, the ability to connect up over wider geographical areas. It's been absolutely fantastic. There's downsides to it. You know, a lot of the meetings, you do get a lot of business done, what I describe as before lunchtime and after. But the reality is it really has maximised the productivity. The downside of that, obviously, is the impact it can have on well-being. Now, it has also, we have also seen the benefit of agility and actually becoming an employer of choice now and reaching out to more people that can actually do a really valuable job for policing, but not necessarily in key niche roles where the expectations are to be out there necessarily on the front line. So it has really made us think about workforce representation, the skills and the way we operate, which is really good. And in most crises, the senior leaders will look at that opportunity to take matters forward and to develop a service. And I think technology in the workforce and how we embrace these sort of crises is a great opportunity in terms of taking things forward. But I think I also have to say on the negative is what we started to see during the last summer with a lot of issues that followed the George Floyd killing in America, the protests around Black Lives Matters and the importance of that issue, not only for society, but also for policing as well, is that we are looking at a risk this summer of what could potentially be a summer of discontent. People will start to get released back out in society and get some normality back. There's bound to be an opportunity for good weather. There's bound to be an opportunity for licensed premises to open up. And this all could come during that July-August period, particularly if the rate of vaccinations continues. And that fragmented society, that tense society could be released, and that will put increased pressure on policing and other public services. And I think we just really need to be mindful about what's happened to society and then what could happen in the future, in the immediate future this summer and then beyond. There are, it's a really tough time for the country. There's going to be implications for us for decades to come, particularly financially, economically, etc. But there's opportunities there, and together, if we continue that cohesion, that close partnership working, exploiting technology for the future, there's no doubt that policing could put itself on the front foot to deal with anything that comes through the door. So Peter, that sort of concludes my reflections on the pandemic.
Paul, thanks so much. Some great points there, and I think I've developed 4 R's of my own. I'm rapidly recognising refreshment is required. I think the speakers have to have the day jobs to get on with. We've got about 5-10 minutes for questions now. So if I could ask the 4 speakers to put their cameras back on and unmute their mics. That's great. And what I'd originally intended was to questions have been going on as you've been speaking in the chat column, but rather than sort of throwing it open, there's 2 themes that have come out loud and clear, both in your inputs and also the questions that have been asked. And one of the early questions from Sharon Johnson and repeated by others was about well-being of staff and how you make sure that during these difficult times that you absolutely get this right. Could I start with I'll probably ask the 3 police officers this. Could I start with Marc, please, and ask for your reflections on welfare again?
So yes, to be fair, the welfare structures have existed because they're all fairly big organisations. Any police officer working for an organisation. Long term, the role where we're going to play a part in this, and what I can see coming along is that, and people have touched upon it, as long as there are ways of keeping people engaged and in the workplace, then the organisations will steer through it. The difficulty is when somebody gets frustrated and gets disengaged from the organisation because something horrendous has happened to them, actually managing that's happening in their personal life as actually, and also managing that within the workplace to try to blend the 2 together, it is going to be the challenge.
Thank you, Marc. Paul?
Yeah, so from my point of view, I sit on the National Police Wellbeing Service Board, who run an organisation called Oscar Kilo, which is all about public services, blue light frameworks, mental health support, etc. And I think it was something that came from 10 years of austerity, which stripped away a lot of policing, a lot of occupational health support, if I'm honest, across the whole service, and us not really taking the human impact of the withdrawal of those resources. And I think we were bouncing back from that position that I've seen over the last couple of years, and we were getting to a better position. We've also got the police covenant coming in, which is hopefully give a bit of a framework and support from other government agencies. But the reality is, I don't think obviously we expect or anticipate the human impact from the COVID on our own officers. And I think that's the bit that we can run on adrenaline, can't we, for a long time. And most academics and health experts will talk about actually it's quite good to run on adrenaline for a short period of time, but not this long. And I think that's the bit that we've just got to watch as senior leaders, is what will be the medium and long-term impact of this whole crisis on our workforce, and how can we best support them.
Thanks, Paul. Quick question from David Morgan is, how well known is Oscar Kilo?
I think in policing circles, I'm looking to my colleagues here, it's improving. And I think probably through senior leaders, it probably is well known as a resource, to be honest. But it's like any form of communication to 200,000 people is you've got to work really hard to get messages across. And I think there is an impetus to keep pushing that. And there are other key agencies and public services that do follow it. So I'd encourage anybody that's following it just to have a quick look on the internet and just start to see some of the resources that are available, because they are extremely helpful, supportive, and set the right tone for all police services.
Okay, thanks. Colin, you got your hand up?
Yes, sorry. What am I? Yeah. It's just something I wanted to add there about particularly the working from home and support and so on. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is, and you were talking about the culture earlier, Paul. It's really interesting that traditionally this idea of working from home culturally has been viewed as a bit of a jolly. If you get, it's a bit of a jolly, and I think that it would influence this idea of how you support people at work at home. So you have to put the structures in to support the people at home, but you also have to change the cultural perception that working at home is a jolly, and if you work from home, you don't need support. I think there's another angle to that, another dimension to that debate as well. You can put as much support in as you like for working from people who work at home, but if the cultural belief is that it's still a jolly and they don't need support, then that's going to suffer in the long run.
Thank you, Colin. Marc?
Yes, I just wanted to come back on that point from David, is that it doesn't actually matter how many people know about Oscar Kilo. It's about having the processes to signpost people in to use it when they need it. So I think if that's where the culture of the organisation has to change, is that the time someone said, actually, I'm struggling, I need some help now, and that the people around them say, right, what perhaps you need to start to look at is Oscar Kilo, speak to your occupational health department, just to be able to line managers to be able to signpost and push people in the right direction. Because I don't think everybody does need to know about Oscar Kilo right now. It's when you do need to know about it, how you get to use it, and having that. The cultural thing is putting your hand up in the air and saying, I need a bit of help, which I think a lot of police officers are probably resistant to.
Great. Thank you for that, Marc. Can I move on to smarter working? And we've got a lot of chat going on about that. Particularly, there's some themes coming through from Helen Martin and David Morgan again about you now live in the office, you're sleeping in the office, and it's very difficult to get that balance right. And Pam, one for you in particular, about how you make sure that staff are not working too hard rather than the alternative.
Yeah, really good questions, everyone. And I'll answer that question and weave in some of the wellbeing comments that have been made. The reality is, for me, working from home is actually difficult for people. We're actually seeing people under quite a bit of stress when they are working from home. So making sure that that wellbeing support is available for people, touching in with supervisors, is really important, so that people are all focused on what they want to deliver for the organisation, what they need to deliver. But actually, a lot of people feel very isolated. So I think a hybrid approach is probably something that we might need to aspire to in the future. But also, I think, just picking up on the some of the wellbeing questions, if I may, I think we actually need to be thinking about well-being in a longer term way. So one of the things that I'm doing when we're looking at change is actually, whereas in the past any change management would be all about how much money can we save, actually it's about what can we take from the front line. Because working from home is fine for those that can do it, but ultimately we are an emergency service and we need people on the front line responding to calls. And for me, my absolute ambition is that any change needs to have a well-being assessment, impact assessment, so that we impact the reduction of workloads for our frontline staff. Technology is a massive support, but if it's not introduced properly, it can actually become a bureaucratic nightmare and hinder our frontline officers. So understanding technology, the processes, the impact that they have on frontline is essential, with our ultimate ambition being to reduce the burden on the front line. And then lastly, in terms of, yes, working more agilely, working more smarter. And Colin raised a really important point earlier around compatibility with partners. I think we can really work smarter as an organisation. But boy, oh boy, if we can really share with partners that technological approach, we will be far more joined up in understanding information and understanding community needs. And again, it needs to be in a way that reduces bureaucracy, not builds on processes that our frontline need to deliver.
Thank you, Pam. Colin, any observations on that?
No, I think Pam summed that up quite well, actually. I think that the COVID-19 has accelerated the working from home, but it has also accelerated our understanding and of the problems of working from home. And you're quite right, a lot of people do struggle working from home, and to separate work from the home-life balance and work is very difficult. I perceive it as being the way of work for the future, not just for the police organisation, for many other organisations, universities included. And there are great opportunities from this, but there are threats, and the major threat, as I've highlighted, is the technology to make sure that it is compatible across the organisation and with partners, as Pam rightly points out. But then the support for the staff who are conducting the work at home, is equally important. And yeah, to take the point, the more efficient your administration, the better your end product on the front line. So that, to me, is a fundamental building block of the police organisation. And it really is interesting that people who work at home and work at the administration side, and they understand why this is, have not been subject to much research or understanding of how they fulfil their role and so on.
And if I may, sorry, Peter, if I could just conclude on some of that. You asked the question, how do we manage the amount of time that people work when they are working at home or otherwise? And we've introduced some new technology recently, because without question, people work in far more hours because the laptops were more readily available. So there is a real need for discipline in this area. But actually balancing that with during COVID, when people were perhaps homeschooling with children, and as long as there was good communications with line managers, there's no reason for people to take that first hour off in the day, as long as there were people available to take their children to school. We've done that during COVID because, people have been homeschooling, needing to be more flexible in terms of their working from home. And certainly some of our support staff, as long as there's good communication and that we are delivering, which is essential, there's no reason why some of that flexibility shouldn't remain after the service as unfolds. For me, it's all about communication, coordination, and having the right IT to support that. Those are the things we need to now reflect on and to work on what makes us more attractive as an organisation to work in as a result of that enhanced flexibility. But we are here as an emergency service, and that is why it's important that we get the balance right.
Thank you, Pam. We're rapidly approaching the point where we're going to have to end this, and I could go on all afternoon because it's a part of the business that really interests me. Can I put you all on the spot and ask you in one sentence to sum up the most important reflection for you? And it can be a personal one, it can be an organisational one, but the one thing that you will take from this whole pandemic experience. And Paul's looking most ready, so I'll go there. Colin's looking most pensive, but Paul, yourself, please.
My phrase would be keep calm, carry on.
Great, thank you. Col?
Embrace the changes.
Proud of Wales, proud of our public, very proud of policing.
Marc?
Get yourself a health coach and some fresh air every day.
Brilliant. What a great point to end that on. And everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to share personal, organisational issues and points with us. Is very much appreciated. Colin and myself are ex-police officers. We're on the outside looking in now, and I couldn't be prouder of the way that you've taken care of our communities. I said at the start of this, throughout my policing service, I can't think of a challenge that is as complex and as long-running as this one has been, and you've done us proud. So thank you to you and your members and your staff for everything that you're doing. There's a number of questions about where we can, this will be shared, and we'll share the link for the video for everyone, and for the people taking part in this. Pam, Marc, Paul and Colin, there's been some questions alongside there, and we'll make sure that we get a narrative of that chat so that you can see it. So there are other issues there, and if people want to ask questions of Pam, Marc, Paul or Colin, please get them through to Colin or myself, and we can pass them on to the individuals concerned. So once again, thank you very much, everyone. Diolch yn fawr iawn.